Artem had always been the kind of person who preferred silence to small talk, precision to chaos. After years of renting cramped apartments where the walls echoed with neighbors' arguments and the smell of someone else's cooking, buying his own townhouse felt like a quiet victory. The building stood at the edge of a newly built neighborhood, where every lawn looked freshly combed and every driveway seemed to glisten with a kind of sterile perfection. To him, it was a more than property. It was independence, a space where he could finally work without interruption. As a freelance designer, his livelihood depended entirely on a stable internet connection and the ability to shut out the world. He spent the first week setting up his workspace with almost ritualistic focus. New router, high-speed fiber connection, backup modem, triple monitors glowing like a command center. He even joked to friends that the only thing that could destroy his peace would be a power outage or the apocalypse. But he hadn't met Victor yet. The man lived next door, in a house that looked perpetually half-renovated. Faded paint, rusted gutters, the kind of place that didn't match the clean symmetry of the rest of the street. Victor was in his 60s, retired, and, as the neighbors warned, impossible to please. He seemed to patrol the street like a self-appointed warden, glaring at anyone whose lawn looked too wild or whose car dared to park 2 inches over the curb. The first time Artem met him was over something absurdly trivial. Artem had just finished installing the new fiber line, a thin black cable that ran discreetly along the side of the house before disappearing into the ground. It was barely noticeable, but Victor showed up that evening, tapping his cane against the driveway like a gavel. "You're really going to leave that thing there?" he asked, his tone sharp, like someone discussing a moral crime. Artem blinked, not immediately understanding. "The cable? It's just the connection line. The company installed it." Victor frowned, eyes narrowing. "It's ugly. People like you move in and ruin the aesthetic of the neighborhood. We've spent years keeping this street clean." Artem forced a polite smile, the kind you give when you know arguing will only feed the madness. "It's temporary," he said. "They'll bury it completely next week." "You said that about the recycling bins," Victor snapped before walking off, muttering something about outsiders with their wires and gadgets. Artem laughed it off at first, assuming it was just the usual suburban hostility toward change. Still, he couldn't ignore the way Victor stared whenever he passed by, as if cataloging every movement, every decision. Days turned into weeks, and life settled into a predictable rhythm. Long work days, late-night coffee, the comforting hum of his equipment. Then, one evening, right before a client presentation, his screen froze. The cursor stopped moving, the chat window blinked out, and the Wi-Fi icon turned into a hollow gray symbol of panic. He checked the modem. Lights dead. The router, unresponsive. His stomach sank. Outside, the night air carried the low hum of distant traffic, but on his street, everything was silent. No signals, no connection. He tried his mobile data, but the area was a dead zone. When he finally called the telecom company from his car, the representative told him something that made his pulse quicken. "It looks like physical damage to the line, sir. Not a simple outage. Someone must have cut it." Artem stared at the dark outline of his yard, his mind refusing to process the words. Cut? Who would do that? By morning, the technicians arrived in a white van, their flashlights slicing through the dawn fog. They followed the buried line along the fence until one of them knelt near the curb, brushing away loose soil. "Here," the man said grimly. The fiber was severed cleanly, like a surgical incision. The plastic insulation had been peeled back with precision, and even the protective conduit was cracked open. "This wasn't an accident," the technician muttered. "Someone used a blade." As they moved further, another worker whistled. "Look at this. Another cut, deeper in." The team exchanged uneasy glances. The sabotage extended beyond Artem's property line into the shared network hub at the end of the street. By the time they finished their inspection, it became clear that several homes had lost service. The technician turned to Artem, his voice low but incredulous. Whoever did this knew exactly where to dig. This is professional work. But why would anyone? He didn't finish the sentence. Artem didn't need him to. As the van pulled away, leaving the exposed cables coiled like veins on the cold soil, Artem's gaze drifted to Victor's yard. The old man stood by his porch, hands clasped behind his back, watching in silence. When their eyes met, Victor's lips curved, not quite into a smile, not quite into a sneer, but something between the two. And in that single expression, Artem felt the first sharp sting of certainty. This wasn't an accident. It was personal. By the following morning, Artem's quiet neighborhood no longer looked like the manicured utopia that had lured him there. The air hummed with confusion and irritation. Several neighbors stood outside in their robes, clutching their phones, muttering about the internet outage that had paralyzed half the street. A delivery van idled helplessly, its driver complaining that his scanner couldn't connect to the system. Children were late for their online classes, and remote workers, people like Artem, were staring at dark screens and missed deadlines. But while everyone else grumbled, Artem's unease was heavier, sharper, because he already knew what had happened. He watched from his window as two Telecom trucks parked near the utility box at the end of the street, their hazard lights flickering in the pale morning light. The technicians moved methodically, lifting metal covers, unrolling cables, and muttering in tones that grew increasingly grim. Artem felt a pull in his gut, a mixture of dread and vindication. He had spent the night reviewing his security footage, and what he'd seen had turned his stomach cold. At exactly 2:30 a.m., the infrared camera by his fence had caught a figure. Tall, slightly hunched, wearing a dark jacket and a brimmed cap. The person had approached the fiber connection point with a flashlight and what looked like a small toolbox. The timestamp showed they spent more than 20 minutes crouched near the junction before disappearing into the darkness toward the street's main box. The resolution wasn't sharp enough to show the face clearly, but the gait, the shape of the shoulders, the slow, deliberate movements. It was unmistakable. It was Victor. Artem replayed the clip a dozen times, pausing on the moment the figure turned slightly toward the camera, revealing the glint of glasses beneath the brim. The realization left a sour taste in his mouth, half fury, half disbelief. Why would someone do this, just out of spite, because of a cable? It seemed absurd, almost childish, and yet the damage was very real. By mid-morning, one of the technicians knocked on Artem's door, holding a clipboard and a grim expression. "You're Mr. Lebedev, right? We found the main cause of the outage," he said, flipping through his notes. The fiber trunk serving this block was deliberately cut. Someone used a garden spade or a narrow shovel, probably late at night. They didn't just hit your line, they damaged the entire node. We'll need to replace several meters of cable in the junction housing. It's going to take a few days. Artem exhaled slowly, trying to sound calm. "Do you know who might have done it?" The technician shook his head. "Hard to say. But this isn't the first time we've seen something like it. Usually it's an accident during landscaping, but this..." He paused, lowering his voice. "This was deliberate. Whoever did it knew exactly what to target. They even removed part of the protective casing to access the core lines. That's not something a random person could do by mistake." He glanced down the street where Victor stood on his porch, pretending to water his plants, though his eyes were fixed directly on them. The technician followed Artem's gaze and frowned. "That your neighbor?" "Unfortunately," Artem said quietly. The technician nodded slowly, as if he'd seen enough of these small suburban wars to recognize the pattern. "You might want to check if your security cameras caught anything," he suggested, already knowing the answer would be yes. "Our company might need the footage. Damaging a fiber distribution hub is considered interference with infrastructure. It's serious. When the technicians left, Artem sat in his car with the engine off, staring at the footage again. The evidence was there, but he hesitated. Reporting a neighbor wasn't something he took lightly. Still, the image of Victor's smug face the day before, his complaint about ugly wires, replayed in Artem's mind like a taunt. That night he uploaded the footage and sent it to the Telecom company's incident department, attaching a brief explanation. Within hours, he received a formal acknowledgement. Investigation opened. Field inspectors will contact you for further verification. It should have felt like progress, but instead Artem felt the subtle shift in the air, the way the street seemed to hum with hidden eyes. The next morning, his trash bin had been knocked over. 2 of his garden lights were shattered. A smear of mud trailed across his driveway as if someone had deliberately dragged a shovel there. It was petty, but it carried a message. Victor wanted him to know that silence was safer than action. By the 3rd day, the technicians returned, this time with supervisors and a representative from the Telecom's legal division. Artem watched them open the utility box near the sidewalk, and a sharp intake of breath cut through the morning chatter. The cables inside were a mess of severed strands and melted junctions. "This is catastrophic," one of them muttered. "It's not just this street, it's the entire southern grid. Half the neighborhood's data hub runs through this connection." Another engineer knelt beside the box and examined the scorched wires. "There's tool residue. See this edge? That's from a serrated blade, probably a handsaw. Whoever did this, they weren't guessing. They mapped it." The man turned to Artem, his face pale. "The damage estimate is already over $60,000. This isn't vandalism anymore. It's destruction of critical infrastructure." Later that afternoon, a police cruiser appeared, and 2 officers began taking statements from the technicians and homeowners. Artem showed them his footage, his voice steady but taut. When they saw the video, the younger officer muttered something under his breath and called his partner over. "That's clear enough to identify him," the partner said. "We'll have to question the suspect." By evening, the police were knocking on Victor's door. From his window, Artem watched the scene unfold with an almost surreal calm. Victor answered with feigned confusion, gesturing exaggeratedly, his voice rising in disbelief. He pointed toward Artem's house several times, as if trying to turn the accusation around. The officers spoke to him for nearly 20 minutes before leaving, but they didn't arrest him. Not yet. That night, Artem received an email from the Telecom investigator thanking him for the footage and confirming that the damage had been traced to deliberate human interference. They would be pursuing criminal charges. For a brief moment, relief washed through him. But just as he closed his laptop, a sharp knock rattled his door. When he opened it, Victor stood on his porch, his face half hidden by the shadows. His eyes gleamed with something between fury and amusement. "You think you're clever?" he said quietly. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Artem didn't answer. He just met the old man's gaze until Victor's expression twisted into a sneer. "Those wires," he hissed, "were a blight. You people ruin everything with your mess. You'll regret this." He turned and walked away, the cane striking the concrete in deliberate rhythm. When the sound faded, Artem realized his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a slow, simmering rage. He locked the door, sat down at his desk, and looked at the silent monitors around him. The connection was still dead, but in that moment, something else switched on inside him, a cold, determined clarity. Whatever this had turned into, it was no longer a neighborly quarrel. It was war. The week that followed felt like a siege. The repair crews worked from dawn to dusk, digging up trenches along the sidewalk, pulling out blackened coils of fiber, replacing junction boxes with new ones sealed under reinforced covers. The quiet, suburban rhythm was replaced by the drone of machinery and the sharp scent of cut asphalt. Artem's home, once a cocoon of order and productivity, now stood in the middle of chaos. Every morning he would wake to the metallic clang of tools and the low murmur of voices outside his window. He should have felt relief that the telecom company was taking action, yet the tension in his chest only grew heavier. Victor had not spoken to him since that night, but his presence was constant. A figure glimpsed through blinds, a shadow pacing behind the curtains next door, a door slamming every time a technician walked by. Even the neighbors, usually friendly in their restrained way, had started avoiding eye contact, their greetings replaced by polite nods that carried discomfort. Rumors traveled fast on streets like theirs. People whispered that Artem had called the cops on an old man, that he was making trouble for the neighborhood. The absurdity of it all burned like acid in his stomach, but he stayed silent, knowing that anything he said would only feed the narrative Victor was carefully shaping. The first escalation came quietly, wrapped in bureaucracy. A letter arrived in his mailbox with the official HOA letterhead. Neat serif font, pastel border, the sort of document that tried to look harmless. It stated that Artem had violated several community regulations: unauthorized installation of exterior equipment, disturbance of property aesthetics, and contributing to neighborhood disharmony. He stared at the words for a long time, incredulous. There was no mention of Victor, no acknowledgement of the damage or the investigation, only vague references to maintaining visual integrity. At the bottom, a fine, $300, payable within 10 days. He almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. It wasn't about money. It was about power. The HOA moving to remind him that he was still an outsider, that they controlled the rules here. He drafted a calm but firm email, attaching copies of his telecom permits and photographs, proving that the cable installation had been approved. The reply came 2 days later, brief and dismissive. The board has reviewed your appeal and determined that the violations remain valid. No signatures, no names. Just the board. That evening, while pacing in his kitchen, Artem caught a flicker of a movement on his outdoor camera feed. A man was walking along his fence line, a flashlight sweeping the ground. It wasn't Victor. This one was younger, dressed in a maintenance vest, but there was no company logo. Artem stepped outside, his voice even. "Can I help you?" The man froze, muttered something about checking drainage lines, and quickly disappeared down the street. When Artem called the city maintenance department the next day, they confirmed no one had been scheduled to inspect that area. The realization hit like a chill. Someone had been scouting his property, probably under Victor's instruction. That night, the air around his house felt different, thicker, watchful. Even his dog, usually calm, paced restlessly near the door, growling softly at shadows that refused to stay still. The next morning, the technicians finished their repairs and restored the connection. The relief was almost physical. The familiar glow of the monitors returned, the hum of routers pulsing like a heartbeat. For a moment, life felt normal again. Then, just as he began his first video call in over a week, the signal dropped. His browser froze. The screen went black. He checked the modem. No lights. His chest tightened as he looked outside. The main junction box, freshly repaired and locked, had been pried open. The metal latch hung twisted, the cables inside slashed again, this time crudely. The repair crew was gone. The street was empty, and Victor's car was no longer in his driveway. Artem's pulse hammered in his ears as he called the telecom emergency line. Within hours, a new team arrived, and this time they brought law enforcement. The lead technician, a broad-shouldered man with grease-stained hands, crouched by the box and swore under his breath. "He didn't even try to hide it this time," he said. Used wire cutters. Same pattern as before. But look here. He cut through the main feed. That's tens of thousands in damage again. One of the officers took photos while another wrote notes on a pad. "We'll need you to come down to the station later to give a formal statement," the older one said. "This isn't vandalism anymore. It's criminal mischief with intent to disrupt public utilities. That's a felony." The word hung in the air like a verdict. By evening, the police returned to Victor's house. This time, they didn't leave quietly. Artem watched from inside as they led the old man out in handcuffs, his face red with rage, his mouth moving furiously, though the words were lost behind the car doors. The neighbors gathered in small clusters, murmuring, some looking at Artem with curiosity, others with thinly veiled hostility. He felt none of the satisfaction he had expected, only exhaustion. Later, as the police car disappeared down the street, he noticed a small group of people standing outside the HOA office at the corner. The president, a neatly dressed woman with a fixed smile, was speaking to them in a hushed tone. When Artem approached, she turned that smile toward him, but her eyes were cold. "We regret the incident," she said, as though rehearsing a statement. "But perhaps if there had been better communication between neighbors, things wouldn't have escalated this way. You have to understand, people here value harmony." "Harmony," Artem repeated, his voice calm but sharp. "He destroyed public property." She sighed as if speaking to a difficult child. "We'll let the authorities handle it, of course, but maybe take some time to reflect on how we can all contribute to a more positive community atmosphere." Her words dripped with condescension, and something inside Artem hardened. When he got home, he found a new note taped to his door, a printed message with no signature. "Keep your cameras pointed at your house, not the neighborhood. Last warning." He stood in silence for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. The line had been crossed long ago, but now the game was changing. This wasn't just about Victor's anger or some HOA power trip. This was coordinated. Someone wanted to break him down, to make him yield quietly, to stop fighting. But instead of fear, a cold resolve settled in his chest. He backed up his footage to multiple drives, set his cameras to higher sensitivity, and placed one facing the street directly. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one. He would document everything, every shadow, every movement, every whisper that turned into a threat. By the time he shut off the lights that night, the street outside looked deceptively peaceful. Lawns glistening under the lamplight, houses lined up like teeth. But Artem knew better now. Behind that order, something rotten pulsed, and it had finally noticed him. By the time the first court notice arrived, the story had already spread through every whispering corner of the neighborhood. People no longer hid their curiosity. They slowed their cars when passing Artem's house, leaned toward each other at community meetings, and spoke his name in sentences that always ended with ellipses. The letter from the Telecom company, thick with formal language, confirmed what Artem had already suspected. The total cost of the damage had exceeded $60,000, enough to classify the act as destruction of critical infrastructure under federal law. The police had collected the tools found behind Victor's shed, wire cutters, a serrated saw, and a set of rubber gloves still coated in the fine dust of burnt insulation. The forensic report was unequivocal. The prints matched. The evidence was airtight. But the case, instead of closing, began to mutate. The HOA had quietly hired a lawyer for Victor, claiming he was acting under the impression of assisting neighborhood maintenance. The phrase was so absurd that Artem read it twice, thinking it must be a joke. Yet it was real, printed on glossy letterhead and filed into the legal record. What had begun as vandalism was now being reframed as a misunderstanding between residents. Even worse, Victor's lawyer began to weave a narrative of a negligence, that the Telecom company had installed unsightly and potentially unsafe cables without the proper neighborhood approval, and that Victor, a concerned resident, had simply taken initiative to restore order. The audacity of it would have been laughable if it weren't working. The local paper published a small piece about the incident, one that framed the situation as a conflict between a tech-dependent newcomer and a long-time resident advocating for community standards. No mention of the felony charge. No mention of the $60,000 in damages. Just a thinly veiled story about modern isolation clashing with old-fashioned values. Artem read it at 2 a.m, the blue light of his monitor reflecting off the newspaper's website. He could almost hear Victor's smug laughter in the wording. By the next day, HOA representatives began circulating surveys about property harmony and visual consistency. His house, with its new wiring and visible security cameras, was listed as a case for review. The implication was clear. They wanted him quiet, cornered, and gone. When the Telecom company's investigators returned for a follow-up report, Artem handed them everything. Video footage, time-stamps, even screenshots of the threats he had received. One of them, a young woman with tired eyes, reviewed the materials and exhaled sharply. "This is more than a local issue," she said. "The city's infrastructure division has opened a formal case." The man didn't just cut a cable, he damaged a fiber trunk that carries emergency communications for this area. The FCC is involved now. He's not walking away with a fine. Her words should have brought comfort, but Artem had already learned how little comfort justice provided when bureaucracy was involved. Within days, Victor's lawyer filed a counterclaim accusing Artem of harassment and defamation, alleging that he had edited and manipulated the footage to smear an innocent man. The HOA, predictably, issued a statement supporting Victor's right to due process. It was a masterpiece of doublespeak, every sentence carefully constructed to appear neutral while quietly suggesting that Artem was the aggressor. That evening, he sat at his desk surrounded by folders, printouts, and screenshots, trying to make sense of the absurdity. Outside, the neighborhood glowed with its usual artificial calm, every porch light timed perfectly, every garden trimmed to the same measured neatness. It all felt suffocating now, like a stage set built to hide the rot beneath. It was around that time that he received the anonymous envelope. There was no return address, no markings, just a thin beige envelope tucked under his door late one night. Inside was a single printed page, folded twice, with a short message typed in all caps. They knew he would do it. Check the board emails. Beneath the words was a USB drive, small and unremarkable. For a long moment, Artem simply stared at it, turning it over between his fingers, wondering if it was bait or truth. Then, with a deep breath, he plugged it into an old laptop disconnected from his network. The files inside were a mix of scanned documents and emails, dated over the past 6 months. They were from the HOA's internal correspondence. Messages between the board president, the property management company, and a name that appeared repeatedly, Viktor M. Kovalenko. The first email made his stomach tighten. It was from the HOA president to a property maintenance contractor. Mr. Kovalenko has expressed strong concerns about the visible cabling along several homes. If possible, please remind homeowners to conceal or remove any visible wires before our spring inspection. Certain residents have been slow to comply. Mr. Kovalenko volunteered to assist with enforcement. The word assist was underlined. Another message, sent 2 weeks before the incident, was even more damning. Victor is growing impatient about the cables near 84 and 86 Elm Court. He claims the new resident refuses to cooperate. I've told him we can't take direct action until next month's review, but he's threatening to handle it himself. I suggest we ignore him. He'll calm down eventually. Artem sat in silence, reading line after line, each message painting the same picture. They had known. They had allowed him to act. They had chosen inaction because it was convenient. The final email was dated the day after the first cut. This situation is unfortunate. Let's keep communication minimal until legal clarifications are made. If asked, we were unaware of any interference with Telecom property. There was no signature, just the digital stamp of the HOA's domain. The revelation left Artem dizzy with a kind of hollow anger that no words could express. He printed everything, sealing the documents in a folder, and sent copies to the telecom company's legal department. Within hours, he received a call from their attorney, a calm, deliberate voice assuring him that this changed everything. If these are authentic, the lawyer said, the HOA's liability just became enormous. This isn't negligence anymore, it's complicity. The following day, the company filed a civil complaint against both Victor and the HOA, citing willful destruction of infrastructure and coordinated negligence. The news hit the community like a hammer. HOA members were summoned for questioning, and the president abruptly resigned, citing health issues. Yet even as the legal machine began to move, Artem's life became unbearable, his mailbox filled with unsigned notes accusing him of ruining the neighborhood. Someone poured bleach over his lawn, leaving streaks of dead grass like scars. At night, his cameras captured shadows moving at the edges of his property, too distant to identify, too close to ignore. Still, the tide was turning. The local news, which had initially painted him as the overreacting newcomer, now ran a follow-up segment. New evidence suggests HOA knew about sabotage before $60,000 damage incident. The anchor's voice was neutral, but the subtext was clear. For the first time, the story wasn't about a petty neighborly dispute. It was about corruption, accountability, and the quiet cruelty of systems that hid behind civility. The next morning, when Artem walked his dog past Victor's now empty house, the police had seized it as part of the investigation. The street felt different. The silence was still there, but it was no longer oppressive. It was the silence that follows a storm, when the debris is still scattered and the air smells faintly of burnt ozone and fresh beginnings. He knew it wasn't over, not by a long stretch. The lawsuits would drag on, the board would try to rebuild its image, and someone, somewhere, would still believe the lies printed in that first article. But as he stood there, watching the sunrise glint off the repaired junction box, Artem understood something vital. This had never been just about a cable or a neighbor. It had been about control, about the lengths to which small-minded power would go to maintain its illusion of order. And for the first time since the nightmare began, he no longer felt small within it. The weeks that followed the revelation turned the neighborhood into something almost unrecognizable, a strange hybrid of paranoia and polite hostility wrapped in the illusion of suburban peace. The street still gleamed in the morning sun, the hedges remained manicured, and the HOA newsletter still arrived on schedule with cheerful updates about flower contests and community barbecues, yet behind every email and every smile was a current of quiet resentment aimed squarely at Artem. He had become the symbol of disruption, the man who had dared to expose what everyone preferred to ignore. The HOA board, now operating under an interim president, began sending out notices about necessary security upgrades and community image restoration projects, which in practice meant new restrictions on surveillance cameras, fencing, and exterior wiring, rules so specific that they seemed designed entirely around our team's property. His mailbox overflowed with paperwork. Every week brought new letters accusing him of minor infractions. His porch light was too bright, his camera angle violated privacy guidelines. His dog barked for longer than allowed by the neighborhood noise regulation. Each letter came signed by different board members, none of whom had the courage to speak to him directly. It was bureaucracy as harassment, polished and relentless. Artem documented everything. He kept a detailed log, scanned every notice, and backed up every recording. The Telecom company's legal department had already warned him that the HOA might attempt to discredit him before the civil hearing. But even he hadn't anticipated the sheer pettiness of their tactics. One night, around midnight, he heard a dull clatter outside his window, a sound too deliberate to be random. When he checked the security feed, he saw two figures crouched near his fence. They weren't vandals. They wore reflective vests and carried clipboards, pretending to inspect the property line. He stepped outside, his phone recording in hand, and called out sharply. The men froze under the porch light before muttering something about survey work and retreating toward a white pickup with the HOA logo stenciled on the door. The next morning, a letter appeared taped to his gate. Unauthorized confrontation with HOA field staff may result in legal action. It was signed only management. The message wasn't about legality. It was a threat wrapped in protocol, the HOA's favorite language. The stress began to grind him down. He worked less, slept poorly, and spent most of his evenings reviewing footage, his mind looping through the same what-ifs and counter-arguments. Yet amid the exhaustion, his resolve sharpened. His lawyer, a pragmatic woman named Evelyn Reese, encouraged him to stay focused on the larger goal. The upcoming court date, where the HOA and Victor's defense would face the Telecom company's evidence. She warned him, though, that they were preparing something. "They've filed a cross-claim," she said one afternoon, sliding a folder across the cafe table. "They're accusing you of defamation and community disruption. They want damages for emotional distress." Artem stared at the papers, stunned by the absurdity. "They covered up a felony," he said quietly. "They cost the city $60,000 in damages." Evelyn's expression remained steady, but her tone was dry. "That's not how people like them think. To them, you're the problem because you didn't stay quiet. Don't let them twist the narrative." 2 days later, he received a summons to attend a mandatory mediation session organized by the HOA. The meeting was held in the community center, a sterile hall with beige walls and the faint smell of disinfectant. About 20 residents showed up, though none would meet his eyes. At the far end of the table sat the new interim president, a man named Harold Keene, whose smile was practiced to the point of parody. "We're here to find peace," he began, his tone dripping with sanctimony. "Mr. Lebedev, while we recognize the unfortunate events that have occurred, we must acknowledge that your actions have disrupted the unity of this neighborhood. The media attention, the legal escalation, it has affected everyone." Artem listened, his hands folded tightly in front of him. When they finished their rehearsed monologue, he spoke slowly, every word deliberate. "Unity isn't built on silence. You let a man destroy public infrastructure because you didn't want to confront him. You let him target me because it was easier than standing up to him. That's not unity. That's cowardice." The room fell silent. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Another coughed, but no one contradicted him. Harold's smile faltered for the briefest second before he dismissed the meeting under the pretense of rescheduling. Artem walked out without looking back. That night, the retaliation began again, this time less subtle. His car tires were punctured in the driveway. The security footage captured only a glimpse, a shadow slipping behind the bushes before the lens was sprayed with something opaque. He replaced the camera the next day and handed the footage to the police, who took the report with weary detachment. "We'll look into it," they said. But he could tell by their tone that nothing would happen. Still, he refused to give them the satisfaction of breaking him. He installed floodlights, reinforced the gate, and upgraded his security system to upload data directly to the cloud every few minutes. He even posted a small sign by his driveway. Property under federal investigation. Tampering will be prosecuted. It wasn't entirely true, but it worked. The nights grew quieter, and for a brief moment the hostility receded into wary distance. Meanwhile, Evelyn informed him that the civil case was moving faster than expected. The Telecom's lawyers had compiled not only the internal HOA emails, but also phone logs showing that the president had spoken with Victor on the night of the first cable cut. The timeline was devastating to their defense. A settlement seemed inevitable, yet the HOA refused to admit guilt. Instead, they doubled down, filing a complaint with the local zoning board, claiming that Artem's excessive security equipment violated residential guidelines. The city inspector who came to assess the claim was visibly embarrassed. "They're stretching the rules," he admitted quietly. "But technically, they have the right to request review." Artem thanked him politely, knowing it was just another attempt to bleed him through paperwork. As the court date approached, the tension in the air thickened. Strangers parked near his house at odd hours. A journalist left a note asking for an interview. Even the mail carrier looked nervous delivering his letters. One evening, while sorting through yet another pile of notices, Artem found a single sheet without an envelope. It was handwritten, the ink pressed hard into the paper. "They won't stop until you're gone. Watch the cameras at 3 a.m. He frowned, but did as instructed. That night he stayed up, the house dark except for the faint glow of his monitor. At exactly 3:07, motion alerts triggered on 2 cameras simultaneously. He clicked the feed and froze. A group of 3 men in the dark clothing was gathered near the Telecom junction box, the same one that had been replaced twice already. They weren't technicians. They moved quickly, prying open the metal casing, cutting into the cables. One of them looked up directly toward Artem's house, his face illuminated for a split second by the streetlight. It wasn't Victor. It was Harold Keene. Artem's pulse thundered in his ears as he recorded the live feed, his hands trembling not with fear, but with something colder and cleaner, clarity. They hadn't learned. They thought they could erase evidence the same way they erased accountability. He called the police immediately, but by the time the patrol arrived, the men were gone, leaving behind open wires and footprints in the mud. The next morning, a headline flashed across the local news site. Second incident of cable sabotage. Rocks Elm Court. Sources suggest HOA involvement under investigation. The story spread like wildfire. The telecom company's attorney called him before breakfast, her voice vibrating with restrained triumph. "They're finished," she said. "We have the footage, the timestamps, everything. This isn't civil anymore. It's criminal conspiracy." For the first time in months, Artem allowed himself to breathe. The battle wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. The people who had built their authority on intimidation were finally trapped by their own arrogance. The road ahead would still be long, filled with hearings and counterclaims, but as he looked out at the street, now scarred with trenches and warning signs, Artem felt something close to peace. Not the naive quiet he had once cherished, but a harder, earned stillness, the calm that comes when you know the truth is no longer on their side. The day of the court hearing began with a strange stillness, the kind that always precedes a storm. The sky hung low and gray, the air heavy with a tension that seemed to seep into the courthouse itself. Artem arrived early, dressed in a dark suit that felt foreign on his shoulders. The corridor outside the courtroom was crowded with reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers, their voices hushed but electric. Cameras clicked as he passed, flashes bouncing off the sterile marble walls. He didn't look at anyone. His mind was fixed on the months that had led to this moment. The silence, the sabotage, The endless stream of letters and threats, and the realization that the people who had tried to destroy him were now about to answer for it under oath. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. The Telecom company's legal team sat to his right, their table neatly arranged with binders and exhibits. Across from them, the HOA's representatives looked far less composed. Harold Keene sat stiffly, his expression brittle, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. Behind them, a handful of residents, once friendly faces, avoided Artem's gaze. Victor was there, too, thinner than before, his hands clasped together on the defense table, his face a mask of defiance, barely concealing the tremor of fear. The judge, a tall woman with an austere voice, began the session by reviewing the charges. Her tone was even, but the words cut through the room like blades. Coordinated property damage, criminal interference with municipal infrastructure, and obstruction of an ongoing investigation. Each accusation landed with the quiet weight of inevitability. The Telecom's attorney, a precise and unflinching speaker, laid out the evidence methodically. First came the photographs of the severed cables, the reports from engineers detailing the calculated precision of the cuts, and the invoices proving the staggering cost of repairs. Then came the internal emails, those same messages from the USB drive that showed the HOA had been warned about Victor's intentions and had chosen to ignore them. The courtroom stirred with murmurs when one particularly damning email was read aloud. "He says he'll handle it himself. It's better if we don't interfere." The attorney let the words hang in the air for a moment before turning toward Harold. "That was your response, wasn't it, Mr. Keene?" Harold hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It was before my presidency," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The lawyer nodded slowly, her expression almost sympathetic. "And yet, under your leadership, a second incident occurred, after the first lawsuit had already been filed. You were caught on video at the scene. Would you like to explain to the court why the president of an HOA was personally dismantling telecommunications property at 3 a.m? Harold's lips parted, but no sound came. The silence that followed was louder than any denial. When Victor's turn came, his defense crumbled almost immediately. His lawyer tried to portray him as a confused retiree, a man driven by frustration and misguided civic pride. But the prosecution dismantled that narrative piece by piece. They presented the tools found in his shed, the fibers embedded in the blades and the forensic match to the damaged lines. Then came the video, grainy but clear enough to show Victor crouching near the junction box, cutting through the cables with deliberate care. The moment it played, the last pretense of innocence vanished from his face. He tried to speak, to claim that the HOA had asked him to help, but his own emails contradicted him. The judge interrupted, her tone cutting. "Mr. Kovalenko, you were warned repeatedly by both the HOA and the Telecom company to stay away from that junction. You ignored those warnings. You caused extensive damage to a shared network. Do you understand the gravity of that?" His reply was a broken whisper. "I was just trying to make things right." The judge shook her head, unimpressed. "You made them worse for everyone." As the hours stretched on, the atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to inevitability. The defense grew quieter, their objections fewer. By the afternoon recess, the outcome was all but written. When the judge finally returned to deliver her ruling, the air felt heavy enough to crack. The court finds the defendants, Victor M. Kovalenko and the Elm Court Homeowners Association, guilty of coordinated negligence resulting in property destruction and endangerment of public infrastructure, she declared. Her voice was calm, but final. "Mr. Kovalenko will serve an 18-month custodial sentence and pay restitution to the telecommunications provider and affected residents. The Elm Court HOA will pay a collective fine of $250,000 and submit to state supervision for a period of 3 years. Furthermore, any retaliatory actions toward the plaintiff, Mr. Lebedev, will constitute contempt of court and be prosecuted accordingly. The room erupted in noise, whispers, gasps, and the distant clicks of cameras, but Artem heard none of it. For the first time in what felt like forever, his mind was silent. He stood slowly, the weight of months lifting from his shoulders like dust shaken from an old coat. Victor sat motionless, staring at the table, while Harold rubbed his temples as if trying to erase the verdict by sheer will. Artem looked at them both, not with triumph, but with something closer to pity. They had built their authority on fear, on small, quiet manipulations, and it had devoured them from within. Outside, the reporters swarmed, microphones and recorders thrust forward, questions blurring into noise. He gave no statements, only a short acknowledgement that justice had been done, and that he hoped the neighborhood could finally rebuild. The afternoon light broke through the clouds as he stepped onto the courthouse steps, and for the first time in months he felt the air without the weight of dread pressing against his chest. When he returned home, the street was empty. The HOA sign had been removed, the office boarded up. His internet connection hummed steady and clear. The cameras still watched, but now their quiet, blinking lights felt less like shields and more like witnesses. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat on the porch and listened to the wind move through the trees. For once, the silence meant peace. The storm had finally broken, and though the wreckage would take time to clear, he had survived it intact. The weeks after the verdict unfolded in a quiet that felt almost foreign, as if the neighborhood itself was relearning how to breathe. The rows of identical houses, once watching him with silent suspicion, now seemed subdued, humbled by the weight of what had been exposed. The new state-appointed HOA supervisor held brief perfunctory meetings in the community center, promising transparency and fairness, though few residents bothered to attend. Most preferred to keep their heads down, avoiding conversation, their former certainty about how things were done, replaced by a tentative, uneasy civility. Artem no longer cared for their opinions. He had stopped seeking understanding from people who had watched him burn and only stepped forward once the smoke cleared. His world had narrowed to something simpler, his home, his work, the rhythmic stability of normalcy returning one slow heartbeat at a time. Each morning, he walked his dog along the repaired sidewalks where the asphalt still bore faint scars from the repair trenches. The new Telecom junction box gleamed under its reinforced casing, sealed and protected by tamper alarms. Sometimes, as he passed it, he caught himself glancing at the metal surface, half expecting to find it damaged again, but it remained untouched, a silent monument to everything that had happened. The local news moved on quickly. The scandal had burned bright and short, replaced by newer stories. Victor's house was up for sale, the curtains drawn tight, the lawn neglected. Rumor had it that his relatives wanted to liquidate everything quietly before the foreclosure notices arrived. Harold Keene, stripped of his position and credibility, had left the neighborhood altogether. In their absence, the power games and petty hierarchies that had once ruled the community simply evaporated. Without their orchestrators, the rules felt hollow, like decorations left after a cancelled party. Artem didn't celebrate. Victory, when it finally arrived, felt nothing like triumph. It was quieter, steadier, a relief that settled deep in his bones. The anger had faded, replaced by something more enduring, a calm certainty that he had been right to fight, even when it had seemed hopeless. The stress had carved lines into his face that hadn't been there before, but they were honest lines, earned through endurance rather than defeat. On the night he finally reconnected with his overseas client, the video call came through crystal clear. The small delay that used to plague his connection was gone. The client congratulated him on winning the big case after seeing a news clip online, but Artem only smiled faintly and said it was never really about winning. It was about not letting people like that rewrite the truth. When he stepped outside later, the neighborhood was wrapped in the faint gold of early evening. The air was warm, scented with cut grass and distant rain. For the first time since he'd moved there, Artem realized that he wasn't listening for footsteps or glancing at shadows. The tension that had once haunted every night was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant stillness. He looked at his house, the walls he had rebuilt, the yard that had been trampled and restored, and felt something close to pride. The world hadn't become fairer, and justice hadn't erased the scars, but he had outlasted the cruelty that tried to silence him. In the end, that was enough.